gets the gold star? Was that you, Sarah? No? Who? Yes, Suzanne, well done. Yeah, Tori Amos. Tori Amos is an American singer-songwriter. That is from her debut solo album, Little Earthquakes, which came out in 1992 and is regarded by many as a classic. And that song, Silent All These Years, is a conversation between a woman and somebody, presumably a man or a romantic partner, and where there's been a really unhealthy relationship, as we can at least say that. And she's basically saying, I've been silent all these years, but now I'm going to speak. You're now going to hear my voice. And there's a reference, and I got to say at the beginning, I feel the weight of this text of 2 Samuel 11, and I feel like I should probably not be the one up here teaching it. And I wanted to give, because I think it is fair to say, and I'm not part of the woke mob. I'm not some sort of, I see, I'm taking a break from social media right now. Maybe I'll never go back, but one of the things, one of the accounts I follow is sort of a pro-masculinity account. I try to stay open and interested, and there's kind of a narrative that the world out there is anti-masculine. That feminism is destroying men, and there's a lot of problems with boys and men today. You look at, there's essentially affirmative. The Supreme Court struck down affirmative action based on race, but on gender, every college is like, "Are you a man? Please come to us." Because we have 60% of our students are women and growing, and the campus dynamics are changing. This is true in undergraduate education. It's true in graduate education. Girls and women are surpassing men in education and in many, many professions, and that's a trend that is growing and continuing. And men are having this issue where they're, can't quite finish high school. They finish high school and can't quite get to college, or get to college and can't quite finish college, and then don't know what to do. And there's a lot of things behind that, but so one of the things you see is this rising movement of sort of like, let's recapture masculinity and teach men how to be men, and feminism is bad, because they're sort of blaming feminism. I'm not really sure if it's women's fault that men are not doing well. Don't we believe in personal responsibility in this country? So they're complex questions, but I bring all that up to say, one of the ways in a society where men have been centered and have had the primary voice in society is that this passage is taught, in my opinion, often, not always, but often, in a way where David gets a bit of a pass. Or at least his sin is described in a way that I think minimizes some of the real problems with his actions and the society in which he lived and how men and women interacted in that society. You know this if you, for example, read the study notes of the ESV Study Bible. And I've recommended that Bible, and I still use that Bible. The Bible is the Bible. Some of the translation choices I don't quite agree with it. Some of it I really like. But the study notes, I like them because they have really good dates and maps and are good for the socio-historical context. But I've also said there are places where the footnotes in the ESV Study Bible get it really wrong, which is okay because it's not inspired. Footnotes are not divinely inspired text, so you can sort of do your homework. But if you were to read the Bible study notes in the ESV Study Bible, you would think that David's sin was adultery. Now, it is adulterous because David is married and Bathsheba is married. But I think David's sin is also rape, because there's no meaningful environment where a king can have soldiers bring a woman to his house whose husband is employed by the king, And he gets her alone, and it's not a situation in which there can be meaningful consent. This woman is going to say no to the king with the soldiers outside the door. Would that jeopardize her husband's career in the military? It's all. So we'll get into that. So I think there's a power differential, which doesn't make this two people caught up in a moment of passion. Sometimes this passage gets taught sort of like a bodice ripper, like a romance novel. Two crazy kids caught up in a moment of passion or something like that. And that's so not what this is. And I think that's important because this is not something our society does well talking about. There's still very many people that sort of have, whenever there's a case of rape or sexual assault in which the man is the perpetrator and a woman is a victim, but even in other situations, but you'll often hear things that the person was asking for, or the person put themselves in a dangerous situation, or, well, she shouldn't have been drinking, or she shouldn't have been wearing that, or boys will be boys, or kind of all that sort of stuff. And the way this story is taught, I think, sometimes falls into that. So I begin with Tori Amos. I wanted to begin with a woman's voice, and this is a song where she's talking about sexual assault, and she's trying to give voice to something she's been silent about for a long time. And one of the lines in the song says, where she's talking to this man, "You better pray that I bleed real soon." And she's talking about, you pray that I get my period, because of what you've done to me, which could have been said by Bathsheba in this situation, because she gets pregnant and she has to tell that to David. So this is a heavy thing. I gave you warning last week, and if this is your first time in this class, well, you're jumping into the deep end. But as I've also said, if you're going to get into the text, if you're really going to get into the Bible, you'll find that it is not the family-friendly G-rated text you may have thought it was. And it does deal with the reality of the human condition in all of its forms, and we find that here. So I'm going to say a prayer, which I think we all need, and then we'll continue. Let's pray. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Almighty God, help us as we read. Help us as we think and as we talk. Show us what you would want us to see in this text. We pray this in Christ's name. Amen. All right, so I am going to read, and you guys, I invite you to listen and sort of take it in with fresh eyes, and pay attention to your own inner monologue where you have questions or things stand out that you want to ask further questions about. So, to set the scene, immediately before 2 Samuel chapter 11, we have 2 Samuel chapter 10, which was where this country, the Ammonites, were in battle against Israel. There's a new young king of the Ammonites. He provokes Israel and David. David responds militarily. David fights two major battles. One is fought by his chief general, Joab. In the other battle, David himself gets involved. In both battles, David is successful. And the Ammonites are driven back into their capital city of Rabbah, which is a walled city. And so they've retreated now behind the walls. And Israel has to figure out what to do. David has to figure out what to do. And so that's how we ended last week. So we begin now with verse 1 of chapter 11. In the spring of the year, the time when kings go to battle, David sent Joab, that's his chief general, and his servants with him and all Israel. And they ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained at Jerusalem. It happened late one afternoon when David arose from his couch and was walking on the roof of the king's house, that he saw from the roof a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful. And David sent and inquired about the woman, and one said, "Is not this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" So David sent messengers and took her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. Now she had been purifying herself from her uncleanness. Then she returned to her house, and the woman conceived, and she sent and told David, I am pregnant. So David sent word to Joab, send me Uriah the Hittite. And Joab sent Uriah to David. When Uriah came to him, David asked how Joab was doing and how the people were doing and how the war was going. Then David said to Uriah, go down to your house and wash your feet. And Uriah went out of the king's house, and there followed him a present from the king. But Uriah slept at the door of the king's house with all the servants of his lord, and did not go down to his house. When they told David Uriah did not go down to his house, David said to Uriah, have you not come from a journey? Why did you not go down to your house? Uriah said to David, the ark and Israel and Judah dwell in booths, and my lord Joab and the servants of my lord are camping in the open field. Shall I then go to my house to eat and to drink and to lie with my wife? As you live and as your soul lives, I will not do this thing. Then David said to Uriah, remain here today also, and tomorrow I will send you back. So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day and the next. And David invited him, and he ate in his presence and drank, so that he made him drunk. And in the evening he went out to lie on his couch with the servants of his lord, but he did not go down to his house. In the morning David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of Uriah. In the letter he wrote, set Uriah in the forefront of the hardest fighting, and then draw back from him, that he may be struck down and die. And as Joab was besieging the city, he assigned Uriah to the place where he knew there were valiant men. And the men of the city came out and fought with Joab, and some of the servants of David among the people fell. Uriah the Hittite also died. Then Joab sent and told David all the news about the fighting, and he instructed the messenger, when you have finished telling all the news about the fighting to the king, then if the king's anger rises, and if he says to you, why did you go so near the city to fight? Did you not know that they would shoot from the wall? Who killed Abimelech, son of Jerubasheth? Did not a woman cast an upper millstone on him from the wall so that he died at Thebez? Why did you go so near the wall? Then you shall say, your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also. So the messenger went and came and told David all that Joab had sent him to tell. The messenger said to David, the men gained an advantage over us and came out against us in the field, but we drove them back to the entrance of the gate. Then the archers shot at your servants from the wall. Some of the king's servants are dead, and your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also. David said to the messenger, thus shall you say to Joab, do not let this matter displease you, for the sword devours now one and now another. Strengthen your attack against the city and overthrow it, and encourage him. When the wife of Uriah heard that Uriah, her husband, was dead, she lamented over her husband. And when the mourning was over, David sent and brought her to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. Here endeth the lesson. All right, so as you think about that, take that in, what questions do you have? What jumped out at you as we read that story? Yeah, great question, Gail. Yeah, why did the writers include such an embarrassing and shameful story about the great King David in their text? That is a great, great question. This is one you'd think people would want to bury before it hits the newspapers. Yeah. Okay. So So Andy's question is, what happened in the prologue, kind of the prequel to this story? Did Bathsheba regularly bathe on the roof in such a way that she could be visible? Was she honey trapping him? Okay. Is she using her beauty to advance her standing? That's a question. What else? Yes. If that is the case, uh, yes. Somebody should have told him not to break at least 3 of the 10 commandments because he was unaware of their existence. Yeah. So the king, who's the chief religious and political figure, who's seen the miracles of God, has gotten fuzzy in his recollection of the 10 commandments. Power goes to your head, and so so that makes it okay. 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 Just checking. Right. He succumbed to the wrong thing to do, and I think what I want to encourage all of us to do in this passage and all passages is to stick to the text. So there's something, you want to get a fancy Bible word. It's not really a Bible word, it's a Bible interpretation word, eisegesis. Exegesis is reading from the text and drawing out from what's there. Eisegesis is reading into the text something that's not there. And so it doesn't say that Bathsheba had a repeated pattern of every afternoon at 2 p.m. Doing a wet t-shirt contest on her roof. The text reads that way. Right. It's written as if it's the first time he's seen her, so much so that he doesn't know who she is, even though she's married to one of his chief commanders. It's also written in such a way to clearly indicate this would not have been a daily occurrence. Water was precious. The only reason she's doing this, it says, is to clean herself after her monthly menstruation. So any outflow of bodily fluid, blood, semen, giving birth, menstruation, all those things make you ritually impure, and there were special rites to purify oneself after those things happened, to be ceremonially pure so you can engage in worship in the temple or the religious space. And so she is doing her cleaning after her period. And so at most this would have been a monthly occurrence. And this is not, like you see paintings of like, pouring water over my head. Like, it's quite likely that she is not naked. Like, just, again, eisegesis. It doesn't say she's naked on the roof. She's just bathing on the roof, probably in as modest a way as possible. This is something that is as sexually enticing as, say, breastfeeding, right? There's nothing sexual about this. So she is beautiful. That's what it says. So we want to make sure we're sticking to what's on the text. Could there have been a backstory? Yes. I think the author does not write it in a way where we're trying to get David, his charges minimized. To Gail's point, if you want to make David look good, you don't include the story. If you want to make David look good, you can tell it in a way that makes him look a little bit better. But it is told in such a way. not only after he uses his power to sexually assault a woman, he does everything to cover it up to and including murder, with an incredible level of callousness. Well, let's come back to that. That's a great question. Is it sort of a moral of the moral of the story is don't do this, otherwise you too will lose your kingdom, or something like that? Is it to show? And we'll come back to that at the end. But that's a good question. Yes. Right. Yes, I think that's exactly right. Uriah is described in a way in such a clear contrast to David. And of course, Uriah the Hittite. What's a Hittite? Non-Jewish. He's a Gentile. He's unclean. He's uncircumcised. He's like, he's a Hittite. And yet he has incredible self-awareness. Drunk Uriah acts more righteously than sober David. David, the man after God's own heart. And so, I think the text is clearly trying to show David knew exactly what was wrong. And Uriah is not some oh shucks, I'm just a Hittite. He's a high-level military person who would have been part of kind of the court, and he's not some simple bumpkin sort of person. So, all right, let's read through the text and we'll point some stuff. Oh yes, you got something, Karen. Right. No, yeah. We will talk about that, but that's exactly right. Um, the first verse has so much irony. Exactly at that point. In the spring of the year, at the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab. So you're supposed to go be with your men, and he stays home. And that's not to say that, again, it doesn't say because he knew he would get a monthly chance to view Bathsheba from the roof. But there is something going on with David, and Bathsheba would have rightfully expected David to be out on the battlefield with her husband, and so, yeah. All right, so it's a good place to start. Spring. We think spring, that time of year when a young man's fancy turns to love, is the old expression. But spring here is also the time you go to battle. You see this lots of places, but it's hard to fight a battle in the Middle East in these days in the winter because it's so cold. It also, because you've got to be camping outside at night. It gets below freezing, and you don't conduct a war in the wintertime. And you also get a sense of how commonplace this was. Spring is the time of war because you live in a land with all these different people competing for limited resources and for territory. And Israel is the sort of new kid on the block, is constantly threatened. So this is the time when you go to defend your territory. It's definitely implied that David should have gone with his men to fight in this battle, where David's army is now trying to settle the score, finish what he started with the Ammonites. When the Ammonites provoked him, he attacked, drove them back in the city, and now he wants to kind of complete the task. So it says they ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, the capital, and David is staying behind at Jerusalem. So they're in the process of attacking the capital. This is how you win, right? You don't conquer the whole country at one time. If you can conquer the capital, then you can expand from there. This is what Putin tried to do in Kyiv. You try to go for the capital first, and then you can expand from there. So they're in process of trying to get the capital. The writer says in the beginning of verse 2, it happened late one afternoon. There's, again, sort of irony there, late one afternoon, David arose from his couch, underlining and highlighting David's dereliction of duty. Like not only, like he could have said late one afternoon when David took a break from studying maps of the battlefield. No, he got up from his couch, siesta time. And he's walking on his roof, and there are archaeological ruins from this time, from around this time period, of a very high, like the foundation they found of a very high structure, which was likely the palace of the king. So he's got this bird's eye view of the city, and he sees Bathsheba bathing. And again, it's important to note it's probably a picture. She's probably mostly clothed. There's some. They had what were called, I think it's a mikvah, a pool of water for bathing for religious ceremonies. And in Jesus' day, the temple's not built, but you still would have had these places to go and bathe before you go engage in worship. And that's not what this is, because she's doing it at home. And so again, it's probably a pitcher, maybe a bowl, something like that. But he does see she is very beautiful, and the Hebrew makes that clear. That in English just says very, but I mean she's very attractive. David sent and inquired about the woman. This is your first of the 10 commandments that is broken. It's commandment 10. And you remember what commandment 10 was? Coveting. Thou shalt not covet your neighbor's wife, your neighbor's servant, your neighbor's animals, all those things. And this is clearly, I mean, it's the language is problematic to our 21st century ears about sort of property, women being property, but certainly women were seen more or less as property of their husbands. And so he's coveting her, and she is not his. And so this is his first commandment that gets broken. And so he finds out it's Bathsheba, and we get a lot of information about her. She's seen as a human. She's the daughter of Eliam. She's the wife of Uriah the Hittite. So now he learns she's not just some random person. She's actually married to somebody that's in his chain of command. And we know from other references to Uriah in Scripture that Uriah was one of the best. He's like one of the 30 fighting men of David, like all that. He's one of those guys. Verse 4, it would have been great if it said, realizing she was completely off limits and this would be totally unethical, David then went back to sleep. But he doesn't. It says David then goes to the next step. He sends messengers, and it says, and took her. And she came to him, and he lay with her. There are some people that use the phrase, and she came to him, to indicate consent, that she could have refused the order of the king at that point. I think that's to misunderstand the dynamics of power and how that worked. When a king calls you to the palace, here's this king that's the man after God's own heart and seen as this really righteous person and loves the Lord and all that. Maybe he wants to inquire about how she's doing, what has she heard from Uriah? He's the commander of the military. Maybe that's what he wants to find out. What are you hearing from Uriah? So she comes to him, and it says, and he lay with her. Then we get the point where she had been purifying herself from her uncleanness. And this is important, both to know why she was bathing on the roof, but also this makes it completely unambiguous that the child is David's. There's no possibility that this is Uriah's kid. Yeah. Right. Yeah, I think that's important to note. Mm-hmm. Right. Uh, I think it does not give a time frame. It's a tiny city. If you've walked around the old town of Jerusalem within the old boundaries, you know that you can, there have been some going downstairs and upstairs and stuff like that, but this could have been a quick trip to find out who it is and to have her come to him. So is it a couple days? We have several physicians. Would you like to comment, Carol? There's no safe period. That's right. Right. Uh, yes, please, Carol. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a fair, very fair, and uh, I'm not trying to portray David as a monster. I think I'm trying to portray David in realistic terms. And yes, I think to to decide to stay home and nap while your army is fighting indicates that there might be something going on with him. Um, I think it's also, um, yeah. I think that's fair to say. Um, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so for the online people who couldn't hear that, Dr. Rachel Toombs, our director of formation and also a scholar of the Bible, said that yes, the Old Testament and to some extent the New Testament, but especially the Old Testament, is very spare in its writing, meaning it's not going to be long, flowery, descriptive passages, and it's not George Eliot and going deep into the what people are thinking deep down and all that. It's just there are no laser printers. You're writing this by hand in a very tedious way. You're not going to take a long time to say a big long thing. So if there is a detail that's important, the writer wants us to jump on it and make a big deal out of it. Yes. Right. Right. Yeah. That's also very clear. One word in Hebrew, and took her. Yeah. The other thing to note. David has at least two wives and a harem. Like, it's not like he's sexually starved. You know, uh, this is this is this is somebody who's rich, taking even more just because he can. Um, so, and to your point, Carol, the whatever is going on with him, there's something not quite right, and maybe this is another indication of the extent of his unhealth and where he is mentally. Um, so it says then at the end of verse 4, she returned to her house. There's no cuddling, right? This is not, you're my one true love. We went to prom and now the flame has been rekindled. It's like he's done and she's sent home. Used. The woman conceives and she sends and tells David, I'm pregnant. And I just want to kind of pause and think what that was like for her. Again, you want to be careful not to read into the text, but her husband's at battle. The king has slept with her. She's waiting to see if this takes, and she finds out it takes, and now she's got to decide what to do and how to go about this. I want to just kind of again note that this is not a sudden crime of passion. Like, there were so many steps along the way for David, so many decision points. Seeing the woman is, so that triggers something in him. Then he sends to find out who she is. At that point, I'm just curious. I want to know what her name is. Then he has her brought to the house. Again, it doesn't say. Maybe he himself is still justifying or telling himself, I have some valid reason to talk to her. She's married to one of my commanders. It's like maybe, is he intending at that point to go to have intercourse with her? It's not clear. Like, that's operating under the surface, but he's sort of making all these decisions on the way that then put himself with her, and he takes her and lays with her. And then, of course, the consequences, her pregnancy, and now he's got to figure out what to do. And I do want to say that, yeah. We are going to see, he is going to get caught. We're going to see, so Psalm 51 is seen as David's confession of sin after this instance. And we'll also see him in the text of 2 Samuel talk about it as well. He does have a major sort of realization, sort of looking in the mirror and seeing who he is and what he's done. We'll get to it in the next chapter, his really fascinating and brilliant pastoral work of the prophet Nathan to get David to come to a place of realization. But he's absolutely in this callous, blind inability. I think, to Andy's point, I don't know that if the power has made him fuzzy. I think the power has made him arrogant. And the power has made him believe the hype that he's better and special, that he deserves things that other people don't deserve, that he's entitled to things to which other people are not entitled, and that he's more important, and he's above the law. The rules don't apply to him, is definitely very much his attitude here. The important thing that I want to know, and this is just sort of a PSA, public service announcement. The more you know, there's an understanding of rape that used to be a person simply just forces violently another person to have sexual intercourse against their will. And the way rape is understood now, while that is included, it's using your power to have sexual intercourse with somebody in a situation where the person cannot meaningfully give consent. It can be carried out by physical force, coercion, abuse of authority, or against a person who's incapable of giving valid consent. You think about the Clinton-Lewinsky thing, and you could think of almost any situation. But, her reputation was destroyed. She had to go into hiding for decades. She's only now sort of beginning to come back, and there's still jokes about the blue dress and all this sort of stuff and cigars. And with Clinton, it was sort of like, yeah, it was bad, but haha, but it's even though she wasn't legally an adult, the president of the United States and an intern, the power differential is so great. The idea that she could give meaningful consent is not something that I would hold. So I just want to say that and see if there's any question about that. Yes. Yeah. Bathsheba had two bad options. Yep. Yeah. Disagree with the king or participate in this offer. Yeah. Yeah, I think yeah. There's sort of a shocking level of indifference, kind of to what might happen. Yeah, absolutely. I think did I see another hand up or a thought? Yes. Yeah. Yes, Sandy. Yeah, yeah. So Google it. Monica Lewinsky gave a TED talk, which is really, really worth seeing. Um, and I think about people in my profession. We have to go to all kinds of training about this power dynamic, um, because that's why there's a huge window in the door of my office. There's all these rules about when I can meet with people and all that. Even if I were in my office and somebody were to make a pass at me, if they initiate, if I were to go along with that, um, I, um, I, I cannot be blind to the power differential that's already there before the person walks in the room. And so that would be an abuse of my power. So I'm just kind of naming, like, this is how we understand it today. And I think it's an accurate understanding. And I think if you are someone, I mean, the whole thing about, like, well, she didn't protest or she didn't say anything. It's like, well, there's something called fight or flight and freeze. That's a response to trauma as well. So it's, well, if she didn't say no, then, well, no. And the idea of consent is one has to affirmatively choose and verbally to say yes. If you're drunk, you can't do it. If you're passed out, you can't do it. What were you going to say? Yeah, I mean, and Garrett's just been through it. He's just been ordained, and everybody that's in a ministry position here has to go through some of this training. It's a lot of it is about not creating a culture that normalizes sexualized conversation or focus on people's appearance. So it's everything from what kind of jokes are told. It's yeah, making people feel like their physical appearance is the most important thing about them. Well-meaning compliments that can be a little creepy. It can, yeah. So that's some of the stuff we talk about, and I think it's just to talk a lot about the reality of transference and projection for a person who's a clergy person. Everybody likes to be near the God person. Everybody likes to feel like they really have a special relationship with the God person. And so the training for us is to be aware you're the God person, and people want to get close to you because you're the God person. And you need to be aware that has nothing to do with how great you are as a human being. It happens in every denomination with all kinds of clergy. Just know that that's not a real thing. Don't believe the hype about yourself. And just be really careful that you don't think that that's anything more than, I mean, it's the same dynamic often with therapists, and they go through the same training. Like, you're creating an emotional and intimate bond with people because of your profession, but that does not give you license to do all this other stuff. So it's just kind of, a lot of the education is awareness of that dynamic, and making sure that you are in a place where you make sure the environment's safe for your parishioners and yourself in all of that. So does that help? Yeah. And David maybe did not have that training. I don't know. But so he finds out she's pregnant, and now what he decides to do is to bring, let's start the cover-up. If she's pregnant, I need to get Uriah to have sex with his wife so that he thinks the child is his. So bring Uriah the Hittite home. Joab sends Uriah to David. And David has, how's Joab? How are the people? How's the war? Just completely smoke screening him. Doesn't really care. Is really just trying to get to the point. And verse 8 is another thing where I think Hebrew is an important little nugget you get here. David says to Uriah, go to your house and wash your feet. As you may know from previous conversations in this class about the book of Ruth and other places, feet is a euphemism for male genitalia. So go wash your feet is sort of a wink, wink. Go home and be with your wife. Like, right? Like, I don't know if any of you, when it said wash your feet, if anybody was like, why does it say wash his feet? But that's what it means. Um, this is why in the book of Ruth, it's a little bit scandalous when Naomi tells Ruth, go lay at Boaz's feet on the threshing floor. So Uriah goes out knowing exactly what he's been told to do, and there followed him a present from the king. Food, wine, who knows what. Something the king is sending him home with treats. And Uriah does not go home. He sleeps on David's doorstep. David finds out, tries again. Uriah, you've been on a long trip. Go to your house. In verse 11, Uriah says, and this isn't even his God, but he says, the Ark of the Covenant is in a tent. And Joab and all my fellow soldiers are camping in the field. How can I go down to my house? And he makes it very clear he understands what David is trying to do. How can I go down to my house and drink and eat and lie with my wife? As you live and as your soul lives, I will not do this thing. And so David, persistence, clearly he has. He says, just stay here one more day, and then I'll send you back. And he invites him to dinner, and David gets him drunk. Sends him home, again thinking this time his judgment will be cloudy. And again, David's abusing his power. If the king's like, here, have another margarita. Here, have another margarita. Let's toast. Again, the social norms of the day. So he's abusing his power with Bathsheba, but he's also abusing it with Uriah quite clearly. Again, to the kind of showing his arrogance and entitlement. It says he goes out again, but does not go to his own house. He sleeps with David's servants, somewhere likely in the temple. So in the morning, David writes this letter, realizing it's not worked. He's done everything he can. And he unbelievably put Uriah in the most intense part of the battle and then abandoned him there. And if it wasn't clear enough, that he may be struck down and die. No ambiguity whatsoever. So, carry his note, his death sentence in his own hand. Yeah, I mean, it's so deeply tragic and awful. Can you imagine handing the note to Uriah? That's his death sentence, and Uriah taking it. Some scholars have wondered whether Uriah read it or not. But again, what is he going to do? So Uriah is assigned to this, the most fierce part of the battle, and Uriah dies. And not only Uriah, but other people as well are caught in the crossfire because of the instructions to send Uriah to this really intense place of the battle. Other people die too. So the body count is growing. So Joab then tells David what happened. Again, also abuse of power, making Joab do something that is against his own sense of what's the best thing to do as a commander of troops. Like Joab knows, you don't do this. You don't put your best men right where the arrows can hit them. But he has to do it again because David's the boss. And so again, David's exploitation and abuse of power. So Joab tells David the news. And you get this interesting, can you summarize what he tells the servant who brings the message to David? Kind of what the instructions are? You can paraphrase. Yeah, kind of. He's anticipating that David's going to be upset that Joab took such a risk with the troops, because it's a bad report. The report is, we got so close to the walls, a bunch of our guys got killed. And so Joab is anticipating that David is going to be upset with that. So he says to the messenger, when you finish telling all the news about the fighting and the bad news, if the king gets angry and he says to you, why did you go so near to the city to fight? And tells this whole kind of story about Abimelech, like, don't you remember that time Abimelech got so close and some lady threw a rock on his head? Everybody knows you don't go that close to the walls. Why did you go so close to the walls? So he says, when you tell him the story of getting close to the walls and people dying, and if he's upset and he quotes to you this story about Abimelech, and he's like, everybody knows, don't go near the walls, then I want you to tell him, Uriah the Hittite is dead also. It's sort of a see what David does kind of story. Because then David would be like, oh, now I see why you went so close to the walls. It's a bit of a trap for David to kind of test where he is. Yeah, Wes. Yep. I think Joab is clearly disgusted, but David, as a monarch, has absolute right to do whatever he wants. And so maybe Joab thinks David's discovered something about Uriah, that he's some sort of traitor, that he needs to be eliminated or something like that. And David's instructions, to be clear, I think do show some of his military acumen, that he says, go to the forefront of the hardest fighting and then draw back. Like he hopes that just Uriah gets killed. But obviously in the fog of war, things don't always go as well. So I think, but yeah, Joab knows that something, Joab I think can smell a rat, which is why he doesn't tell the messenger, go tell him we got in some fierce fighting and people died, including Uriah. Like he saves that little bit of information from the end, I think because he kind of wants to hear from the servant when they come back, how did David react to the story? So the messenger tells David all this stuff, and interestingly, the messenger doesn't really follow the instructions. He doesn't set David up for this trap. He says, the men gained an advantage over us and came out against us in the field. We drove them back to the entrance of the gate, and then the archers shot at your servants from the walls. Some of the king's servants are dead, and also Uriah the Hittite. So he doesn't save it to the end, and it doesn't really indicate this whole plan of David of like, go to the fierce fighting and then draw back and leave Uriah by himself. I think what might have been happening is that Joab would know he might face a mutiny if he gives orders to his servants. I mean, how do you say that to the men that are going to this really fierce part of the fighting? How do you say, I want you to go fight there, and then I want you to abandon Uriah and come running back? Like, David, again, to his exploitation and abuse of power, he has put Joab in an impossible position. If to Dr. Crowell's point about Bathsheba facing two impossible choices, Joab faces two impossible choices. Disobey my king or obey him in a way that makes me look like a psychopath. So now I have to actually do something that kills more men because I could never give an order to like abandon their fellow soldier on the field. He was different. Yes, Uriah was the Hittite. He was different. But clearly he's been in the position long enough that he's risen through the ranks, is trusted by Joab, is trusted by David. He's not some schmo. So David finds out what's happened. And what does David tell the messenger to say to Joab? Try again. Yeah. How would you guys put it? What is the messenger told by David to say to Joab? These things happen. The sword devours one and now another, Sometimes an arrow hits you, you win some, you lose some, is his response. Don't worry about it. Don't let this matter displease you. Let that phrase stick in your ears. Don't let this matter displease you. And we came to the end of, what's the last line of verse 27? The Lord is displeased. David sort of thinks he's God. Doesn't matter what God thinks. Just, I'm not displeased. You don't be displeased. It's all fine. But there's someone else who's watching. And he says, keep up with the attack and overthrow Rabbah. Then we hear, we kind of come back to another character in the story in verse 26. Who's the next person that gets mentioned in verse 26? Bathsheba. How is she described? The wife of Uriah. To Rachel's earlier point, when they take the time to say something, they want you to notice it. So he could have just said Bathsheba, but said the wife of Uriah. You know, you hear the redundancy. When the wife of Uriah heard that Uriah, her husband, was dead, like the wife of Uriah, Uriah, her husband. Extra words. Could have just said when Bathsheba heard that Uriah was dead, but the author really wants you to hear she was married, her husband was killed. Like the writer is laying it on thick intentionally. So she laments over her husband. Just let that sink in. She mourned for her husband. She was Jewish, yeah. I mean, almost definitely. We don't know for sure, but and David brings her into his house, and she became his wife and had that child, had that son. But the thing David had done displeased the Lord. So, how many commandments did David break? 3. Which ones? Covet, adultery, and murder. Yeah. So, not just 1, not just 2, but 3. And you could say, you know, the first commandment, I'm the Lord your God, you shall have no other gods but me. Total devotion to Yahweh. And it really feels like David has become his own God in this passage. So, some main points here for y'all. I think we really see David's sin, multiple sins, the layers of sins, the justifications of sins, the cover-up, all of that sort of stuff, leading to multiple deaths, the destruction of Bathsheba's life. It is highly likely to sort of 99 to 100% probability that she already has children with Uriah. Because she's clearly quite fertile, and there's no, the idea of like getting married and waiting to have kids does not exist in the ancient Near East. Like every baby should be a honeymoon baby in that culture. Like you just start immediately. And so her life is destroyed. David's sin is here. So to Gail's point at the beginning, there is an clearly intentional point to help us see David as he truly is, not as this perfect idol, but as the human being that he is. The Bible is very forthright and clear about the reality of sin, and it's not done in sort of, it's not like a don't be bad. It's like, let's tell an honest story about what happens in these kinds of situations, because this is so common. So one of the things that, in a weird way, I take heart in stories like this, as well as all the stories in the New Testament about the disciples, is anybody who says the Bible is a made-up text to sort of cook up some Marxian religion is the opiate of the people sort of thing. Just people made up the Bible. This is the thing you hear atheists say sometimes. People made up the Bible so that they could sort of trick people and hoodwink them and control them. It's like, well, if you were trying to make up a religion, you probably wouldn't put in all the most embarrassing stories. Just like when people ask you, like I know people who met on Tinder and they have some fake story that they tell people. And that's not even bad to meet on Tinder. Like it happens all the time, or whatever dating app you have. But people will sometimes make up false stories about how they met. All of that. But the Bible doesn't do that. It tells the truth, which I think is a point in the is the Bible true question. If there's a point there for its veracity. Yes, Karen. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. David has kind of won the Super Bowl in the previous passage. He has this incredible victory, which also, by the way, maybe to Carol's point, is why he's kind of in this, state of delusion or blindness. And again, not to excuse the sin in any way, but yeah, maybe he thinks he's sort of this godlike figure because he's had this great victory. Yeah. So that's it. Yeah. 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 To balance out. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. He's a human being who made mistakes. So, this is an older version. Okay, we're going to back up. Take that away. So the other point I have is the contrast with Uriah. The Bible always, and you see this in the New Testament all the time. Who are the people that reject Jesus often? His own community. Who are the people that are really into Jesus' words? People from outside his community. The outcasts, the overlooked, the sinners, all those sorts of folks. So there's very much a sense in here with this contrast with Uriah and the gospel, the message of who God is and what reality is and all that seems to have landed more with Uriah in this story than with David. There is, the way I've heard this passage taught most frequently is a description of the progression of sin from one little decision to the next decision, and kind of how we justify as we go. And I do think you see that in this passage. I don't think it's a recipe of how not to sin. Like, reverse engineering never sinning by not doing what David does along the way. I think it's true that if you don't create the opportunity, if you don't justify in your mind and all that sort of stuff, that you won't sin. But I think another thing that this passage wants to show is how, if this was just about kind of free people making good choices as independent, rational agents, that human beings are much more complicated than that. Again, not to give any sort of pass to David here whatsoever, but I think we might get tempted to look at David and say we wouldn't do the same thing in that situation, but we've probably done similar things at different times in our lives. I'm not talking necessarily about sexual assault, but I think one should not look at this and say, I would never do that. One should look at this and say, there are parts of the story to which every human being can relate in some ways. We have all subconsciously created environments where things that can happen that we really don't want to happen, and then they happen, and then we try to justify and we try to cover up. Like, everybody's covered up something, at least once in your life. And so I think there's kind of this parable here to illustrate that. And I think finally the thing I would say is just the passage does, Bathsheba doesn't get to talk, but she's clearly an important figure here, that looking at ahead, Jesus, how he treats women who have been in similar situations. My heart goes out to her in the story, and I think the author wants our hearts to go out to her and see her as a human being, not a temptress, but someone who is taken advantage of and pays an incredibly high price, because this child will die. So she's got the loss of her family, the loss of her household, the loss of her husband, the loss of this child. I mean, it's just grief upon grief and loss upon loss, and she's got no power in the situation. And so seeing then Jesus come to the woman caught in adultery, like, was she caught in adultery? Or was it a Bathsheba situation? We don't know. But Jesus says, let he who is without sin cast the first stone. And when Jesus sees women that have been overlooked and displaced, his impulse is always to bring them in. So I think seeing Bathsheba, the story of David and Bathsheba is an inaccurate description. The rape of Bathsheba by David and his massive cover-up and murder would be an accurate description of the story. And so seeing it in that lens, and then seeing Christ as the one who loves and brings in. I've got to run. The Lord be with you, and I'll see you next week. I'm